Hey there, the paint job is done. I am super happy with how it turned out. Really pleased with the look. In this video, I'm going to be talking about all the really important things I learned on this paint job and from my previous paint jobs, stuff I want to remember for next time. Taking on a painting project like this can be kind of overwhelming when you look at the project as a whole. But one thing that helps me is, instead of looking at the project in its entirety, is I like to kind of break it down into just, what am I going to do today? Like today I'm going to try to get the body sanded with the 150 grit paper and just kind of go through that. And when you start just doing it piece by piece or looking at it piece by piece, it really helps me, just my mind kind of tackle like the big project that this really is. Overall, it is kind of a grueling project. I mean, there's a lot that goes into painting a vehicle. It turns out as good as much effort as you put into it. So I put a fair amount of effort into this and the paint job turned out pretty good. It could be better. I'm not a pro. There's a few little kind of orange, a little orange peel look here and there, but overall I think it's a good look. I'm happy with it. I did want to mention some things, some tips and tricks, things that I want to remember next time I paint my vehicle. If that's a year down the road or something, I'm probably going to go back and watch this video to just kind of cover these things and look at stuff I want to remember to do again. So initially, the initial sanding with 150 grit to take off all the paint and clear coat. You might get down to bare metal with 150, which is fine. After sanding with 150, if you want to sand again with 220 and then up to 320 grit before you can start putting your primer down. Now I used a high build primer and this stuff is thick. It comes out like honey. Next time I'm going to talk to the paint shop about maybe trying to thin it down a little bit, but they didn't recommend that because I was trying to build up primer and get a good layer so I can sand it down. But even with a lot of sanding, and I was sanding with 320 and sanded it a few different times, quite a few different times with 320, and I still didn't get it perfectly smooth. It would have taken me another, gosh, like 20 hours of sanding to get it down perfectly smooth. But sanding it with 320, the primer coat, the high build primer, gave me enough to use to be able to put my top coat on, which was a single stage paint. I elected not to do a base coat and then a clear coat over the top of that. Using the single stage is super easy, is what I did. And using a 320, I think the bottle said 320 up to 500 grit is fine for using the single stage top coat. I also did use some self-etching primer over bare metal spots before I did my high build primer. One thing that helped with sanding is getting like a backing pad on my random orbital sander. A backing pad kind of helps soften some of the sharp edges when you're sanding. If you run over a sharp edge or a corner or something, you're not going to burn through quite as fast, but you still can burn through pretty easy. So the random orbital sander, use it on a lot of the flat surfaces. Try to stay away from the edges and corners. Do those by hand as much as possible. The backing pad will reduce your grit though. So if you're using like a 320 grit paper, it'll reduce it down to like a 400 grit paper because it's just not quite as harsh. And then using a burgundy or maroon colored Scotch-Brite pad is really helpful in getting in all the nooks and crannies and curved areas and indents where the random orbital sander can't reach. The scouring pad works really well. The Scotch-Brite pad works really well to get into those areas. And it is somewhere around a 400 grit. When you're washing everything off, use a lint-free rag, and the microfiber cloths. I got some microfiber cloths off from Harbor Freight. They worked really well. Some lint-free rags I tried using on my last paint job, they really weren't lint-free. They didn't work well at all. But the microfiber cloths worked great. When I was spraying the high build primer, as I mentioned earlier, it's very thick, but I just used primer and activator. I didn't want to use any reducer because that's not what the paint shop recommended. And the paint shop, they're pros. They've painted thousands and thousands of cars. Those guys are experts. So I was really using their guidance. I did 3 good coats of that high build primer. My paint gun for that had a 1.8 tip on it. It worked well, but I think I was going too fast and a little bit too far away, which can lead to more of that orange peel look. So I really need to go slower and closer and get kind of a wet look. And when you're practicing, you can actually spray like some cardboard or something to a point of where it's starting to run. So you'll know where that point is. Like, okay, it's running there, so that's obviously too much. So it's good to practice. And as I've already mentioned, the sand quality when you're doing your top coat or my base coat, it's a single stage paint. Because I didn't do a base coat and then clear coat, I went with just a single stage. That's where the 320 grit sandpaper worked just fine. The sanding quality, like what you're painting on, is really going to reflect how your top coat turns out. And the smoother you get it, the better your top coat, the more pleased you'll be with it. On the paint stage, when it came to painting with this single stage, it's so much thinner than the high build primer. You put on 3 wet coats. With it, again, practice on some cardboard. I ended up with one little tiny spot with one little run. It's right near the headlight. I can remove that bezel and mix up another batch of paint at some point when I want to touch things up. But overall, super happy with how this turned out. I think it's a great project. And for my second vehicle of painting, I think it turned out well. It's not perfect, but it's a Jeep. I'm pleased with it. So on to the next project. Thank you guys so much for watching, and be sure to check out my next video.